Your brain doesn't care about the Super Bowl, and that might be the most honest thing about you. Not because you're broken. Not because you're boring, antisocial, or missing out on something everyone else seems to feel so naturally, but because somewhere along the way, your mind learned a quiet, invisible rule. What excites others isn't always safe, meaningful, or worth your energy. And that rule didn't come from nowhere. It was built slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river, layer by layer, moment by moment. Maybe you've noticed it before. Everyone around you is buzzing with excitement, talking, laughing, celebrating something that feels distant to you. You try to join in. You really do. You nod, you smile, you pretend to care. But inside, there's only silence. A kind of emotional flatline, like you're watching life through glass. And then comes the quiet guilt. Why don't I feel what they feel? Why can't I just enjoy this? But here's the truth most people never say out loud. Your brain is not designed to care about what's popular. It's designed to care about what feels relevant to your survival, and survival for you may have meant something very different. Think of your mind like an ancient guard standing at the gates of a city. It doesn't let everything in. It doesn't celebrate everything equally. It asks one simple question over and over again. Is this important or is this a distraction? For some people, events like the Super Bowl represent connection, belonging, shared excitement. But if your past taught you that connection is unpredictable, or exhausting, or even unsafe, then your brain quietly categorizes these moments as non-essential, not because they are meaningless, but because they were never meaningful to you. This often begins in places we don't immediately think about, small, almost invisible experiences. Not necessarily big trauma, but something quieter, more subtle, something psychologists sometimes call micro-disconnection, moments where your interests weren't mirrored, where your excitement wasn't met, where you learned without anyone saying it directly, that what you feel doesn't quite fit into the room, so your brain adapts. It stops investing energy into things that don't feel personally anchored. It becomes selective, efficient, protective. And over time, that selectivity can look like disinterest. But it's not disinterest. It's precision. You see, emotional energy is expensive. Your brain knows that. So it starts asking a different question. Does this feed me or drain me? And if something feels like empty noise, even if millions of people love it, your mind simply opts out. There's also another layer to this, a deeper one, the way your brain processes reward. For some people, collective excitement triggers dopamine, the brain's "this feels good" chemical. Crowds, noise, shared rituals, they amplify emotion. But for others, especially those who grew up needing to be more inward, more observant, more self-contained, that same environment can feel overwhelming even if it's subtle. So instead of dopamine, your brain releases something else, distance. You detach slightly. You observe instead of participate. Not because you don't want to feel, but because feeling too much in the wrong environment once came with a cost. Maybe it led to disappointment. Maybe it led to being misunderstood. Maybe it led to realizing that the crowd doesn't always see you. It just expects you to blend in. And blending in can feel like disappearing. So your brain learns a quiet rebellion. If I can't feel it authentically, I won't force it. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because sometimes it's not just about protection. Sometimes it's about identity. If you've spent years feeling slightly out of sync with the world around you, your mind begins to build a sense of self around that difference. You become the observer, the one who sees through things, the one who doesn't get swept up in collective hype. And that identity can feel grounding, even comforting. But it can also create an invisible wall, because now it's not just that you don't care about the Super Bowl. It's that caring would feel inauthentic, almost like betraying the version of yourself you've carefully constructed over time. So you stay on the outside, not completely disconnected, but not fully inside either. And the strange thing is, this doesn't just apply to sports. It extends to so many areas of life. Trends, social rituals, group excitement, even certain relationships. Anything that feels externally driven rather than internally meaningful, your brain quietly filters out. And while this can make you feel isolated at times, it's also evidence of something deeper. You don't attach easily to things that lack personal truth. But here's the part that often goes unnoticed. This pattern didn't just happen. It was learned, conditioned, reinforced over time. Maybe there were moments when you did try to care about what others cared about and it didn't land. Maybe you felt like you were performing instead of experiencing, like you were reading from a script everyone else somehow understood instinctively. And that gap, that subtle mismatch, can be enough for your brain to say, next time, don't bother. So it conserves energy, it narrows focus, it builds a world that feels quieter but more controlled. And in that world, something like the Super Bowl isn't rejected with anger or judgment. It's simply irrelevant, like a language you were never taught. But irrelevance can feel dangerous in a social world that rewards saneness. Because when everyone else is celebrating something together, and you're not, it creates a question that lingers in the background of your mind. Am I missing something, or am I seeing something others aren't? And that question doesn't always have an easy answer. Because both can be true, you might not feel the same excitement, but you might also be protecting yourself from a kind of emotional investment that never felt safe to begin with. And that's where things begin to shift, because what looks like indifference on the surface is often a deeply intelligent adaptation underneath. An adaptation shaped by experiences your brain has never forgotten, even if you have. And once you start to see it that way, the question slowly changes. It's no longer, why don't I care? It becomes something quieter, more revealing, what taught me not to? And just as that question begins to settle in your mind, another realization starts to form, one that challenges everything you thought this meant about you. Because the answer isn't what you expect. When your brain learns to filter out what feels irrelevant, it doesn't just remove noise, it can also quietly remove possibility, not all at once. Not in obvious ways, but slowly, subtly, like a dimmer switch being turned down on parts of life you might have otherwise explored. You stop trying new things, not because you're closed-minded, but because your mind has already predicted the outcome. This won't feel like me. You withdraw from shared experiences, not out of arrogance, but out of a quiet certainty that you'll be standing on the outside anyway. And over time, that certainty becomes self-fulfilling. The invisible wall doesn't just keep discomfort out, it also keeps connection from fully getting in. And this is where the cost begins to show up, not as something dramatic, but as a kind of emotional minimalism. Life becomes manageable, controlled, but slightly muted, like watching a movie with the volume turned just low enough that you miss the depth of the music. You're present, but not fully immersed. Safe, but not fully alive in the moment. And the hardest part is, this can feel normal, familiar, even preferable. Because your brain isn't trying to deprive you, it's trying to protect you from something it once believed you couldn't handle. But here's the quiet truth that begins to change everything. The version of you that needed that level of protection doesn't fully exist anymore. You've grown. You've understood more. You've survived what you once thought you couldn't. But your brain hasn't completely updated its map. It's still guarding against old dangers, using old rules in a world that may no longer require them. And that's where the shift begins. Not by forcing yourself to suddenly care about everything, but by becoming curious about what you've been unconsciously avoiding. Not with pressure, not with judgment, but with a kind of gentle openness. Instead of asking, why don't I care about this? Try asking something softer. What would it feel like if I allowed myself to experience this without expecting anything from it? Because the goal isn't to turn yourself into someone who suddenly loves the Super Bowl or crowds or trends. The goal is to loosen the grip of that invisible rule that says you can't. You see, there's a difference between authentic disinterest and conditioned avoidance. One comes from knowing. One comes from knowing. Yourself. The other comes from protecting yourself. And healing begins when you can tell the difference. Maybe you still won't care about the Super Bowl, and that's okay. There is nothing inherently wrong with that, but maybe, instead of feeling disconnected from people who do, you begin to understand them differently, not as something foreign, but as something human. A shared rhythm you can step into briefly without losing yourself, because connection doesn't always require full immersion. Sometimes it just requires presence, a willingness to stand near the fire, even if you don't feel the same warmth as everyone else. And in doing that, something subtle begins to shift inside you. The observer softens, the distance shortens, and the world, which once felt like something happening around you, begins to feel like something you can gently step into on your own terms. This is how the wall becomes a doorway, not by tearing it down, but by realizing it was never locked. You were just never shown how to open it safely. So you start small. You allow moments of low-stakes participation, conversations, shared laughter, even things you don't fully understand. Not to force meaning, but to discover it. You let yourself feel slightly out of place without interpreting it as something being wrong. Because sometimes growth doesn't feel like belonging right away. Sometimes it feels like unfamiliarity, and that's okay. Because you're no longer trying to become someone else. You're simply expanding the space of who you already are. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your brain begins to update its rules. Not everything is a threat. Not everything is empty. Some things are just new, and new doesn't have to be avoided. It can be approached gently, patiently, without expectation, and maybe one day you'll find yourself in a moment. Small, ordinary, almost forgettable, where you feel something you didn't expect. A flicker of connection, a quiet sense of belonging. Not because you forced yourself to care, but because you finally allowed yourself the freedom to experience. And in that moment, the question that once haunted you, "Why don't I care?" will fade into something softer. Maybe I just needed the right way to feel. So if you have ever stood on the outside of something everyone else seemed to understand, if you have ever questioned your own reactions, your own detachment, your own quiet way of being, know this: you were never empty. You were adapting. And now you're learning how to choose. And if this story felt like it was speaking directly to a part of you that rarely gets seen, then maybe, just maybe, you're not as alone as you thought. And maybe this is where something new begins.